Hello, my dears. I'm sure you're surprised to hear me today, and not Yoha. We decided to share the pleasure. Yoha will tell you about the world of wizards and the school, and I will take you into the forests, to the woodland elves and the magical beings who have found a home in Runental. As you can easily guess, today is not about wizards. We step back a few weeks in time and enjoy an adventure of the woodland elves. Now relax, lean back, and let yourselves be guided by the old paths of the forest. In the south of Runental, where the warmth of the Flame Gorge makes the climate milder and more humid, lies a small special house, the House of Healers. Nestled between banana plants, palms and lush ferns, it rests naturally at the edge of the forest. The walls are built of pale stone, covered with moss. The roof is made of green reed, and wild-flowering pitcher plants climb over the veranda. A wooden wind chime hangs at the entrance and rings softly whenever a warm breeze drifts over from the river. The garden is a green oasis, raised beds filled with healing herbs, zinc tubs full of fragrant mint and lemongrass, and a small path of flat stones leading from the house to the practice room. Here things are stirred, dried, mixed, and healed. On open shelves along the house wall hang bundles of dried leaves, small jars of salves stand in neat rows, and the scent of ginger root, moringa, and coconut blossom honey always lingers in the air. The house is simple, but full of life. There are only a few rooms, an open kitchen with a wide table, a workroom for Dory and Flo, Mero's small room, and under the roof a sleeping loft for Hera. Everything is built from natural materials, wood, clay, stone, no luxury, no excess. Flo, with his braided beard and calm eyes, sliced bread and placed it on simple wooden boards. His voice was deep when he spoke, but most of the time he remained silent, listening, observing, even at breakfast. Dory, his wife, wore her hair half open, one loose strand bouncing with every movement. She was just telling them about a young swallow they had treated yesterday, with a broken wing, but a lively gaze. Mero, their 7-year-old son, listened half-heartedly, half lost in his own thoughts. He had placed his feet on the chair's crossbar and was playing with a small wooden fish a dwarf had once carved for him. Then, a dull wing beat, a soft thud on the windowsill. All three looked up. A grey owl with amber-coloured eyes. There was a message tied to its foot. Dory carefully opened the small parchment roll. "From Jan," she said. "My brother received a herd of wild boars from Hiob the hunter. He asks us to examine them tomorrow morning so he can take them into breeding." A smile crossed her face. "I'm looking forward to seeing him again." Flo nodded. "And I'm looking forward to Figo, my brother," he said quietly. "It's been a long time since I sat with him in the forest inn." Mero had already jumped up, not this time out of impatience, but pure excitement. "Then I'm allowed to fish in Whisperbrook tomorrow, right?" he asked. "Hiob said the dwarves need mountain trout again, and that's where the best ones are. They like the cold water the most." Dory laughed. "Of course you can, but first, please go to Macro and tell him to pick us up at the dock early tomorrow." Mero nodded eagerly and was already out the door. Mero ran the familiar path to the ferryman, delivered the message with shining eyes, thanked him politely, and ran straight back home. In his room he carefully laid out his fishing equipment, hooks, lines, bait, a small dented bucket, and his carved wooden fish as a lucky charm. But what he hoped for most was still not in his possession. A fishing rod made by dwarf hands, one of a kind, finely crafted, light as a twig, strong as iron. Hiob had promised it to him. If he brought enough trout, the dwarves would build one for him. And tomorrow, he hoped, that dream might finally come true. The next morning dawned quietly over Runental. Warm, humid air hung over the palm crowns, and from the distant flame gorge a soft steam rose, drifting like threads of mist over the waters of the glass stream. Flo, Dory, and Mero stood at the wooden dock on the west bank of the river. Beside them were 2 large baskets filled with tinctures, bandages, healing herbs, and fragrant tropical fruits: bananas, mangosteen, coconuts, ginger roots, moringa leaves, and a small bundle of lemongrass. Dory had put everything together with care, as a gift for her brother John and his family. Mero clutched his equipment tightly, and his face was filled with pure anticipation. Not only for the journey, but for fishing in Whisper Brook, where cool currents gather and mountain trout wait in schools. Then the ferryman appeared. Macro Quelbach, a 27-year-old woodland elf with calm, almond-shaped eyes and soft, friendly features. He docked the ferry, jumped ashore, and began loading the baskets. But his gaze wandered searchingly, clearly disappointed. Dory smiled. Hera can't come today. She has to look after the practice. Macro blushed slightly and tried to hide his smile, unsuccessfully. He moved a few levers, and the ferry began to move upstream, as if by magic. Yet, as so often in Runental, it was not magic that moved the boat, but a finely engineered mechanical masterpiece created by the dwarves. Deep in the rune forest, where the glass stream flows with a strong gradient, the dwarves had built a large mill many years ago, unassuming from the outside, yet inside a massive water wheel turned steadily, driven by the constant pressure of the river. It was fortunate that the glass stream flows from the southern shore of Lake Mist in an almost straight line through the southern forest, without sharp bends, perfectly suited for a cable system stretching over several kilometers. At the outlet of Lake Mist, where the glass stream is born, the dwarves had built a massive bridge, a technical platform housing countless pulleys, gears, counterweights, and anchor points. Through this system, the force was transferred to the drive cables to which the ferry was connected. By operating the levers on board, Macro could control whether the ferry moved upstream or downstream, toward the right bank or the left. No magic was required, only the knowledge of the dwarves, who contribute just as much to Runental as the magicians do. A soft humming sound began, barely audible, and the boat glided past moss-covered stones and sleeping dragonflies resting on broad water plants. No one spoke a word. It was one of those days in Runental meant not for speaking, but for listening. The boat journey took nearly 2 hours. Slowly and steadily, they made their way along the glass stream, and Mero, who had dozed off in between, dreamed of flashing trout and a fishing rod handle made of dwarf wood. Upon reaching Lake Mist, they were greeted by moist meadow air and the first rays of sunlight. From there, they still had about 20 minutes to walk, across soft grass and past apple trees, until the farm of John and Leafil came into view. John, Dory's brother, was already waiting at the gate. His shoulders were broad, his smile open, and he wore a grain cord tied around his waist, as was customary for the farmers of Runental. "I hope we can manage those beasts," he called when he spotted Flo. "They're restless and huge. I can't even see over their backs. Maybe you can calm them down, brother." Flo merely smiled calmly. Calming animals was his gift, more listening than commanding. Together they went behind the farm to the enclosure where the wild boars waited. Meanwhile, Dory and Mero went into the house. There stood Leafil, a tall elf woman with curly hair at the large hearth, preparing lunch for everyone. "Hello, Aunt Leafil," Mero called. "Where's Liam?" "Hello, Mero," she replied in her gentle voice. "I last saw him outside in front of the house. I think he's looking for worms again." "Okay, please tell him I've already gone down to the brook." And before anyone could say another word, Mero was already out the door, running down the familiar path and disappearing between the meadows along Whisper Brook. Dory laughed softly, tied an apron around her waist, and helped Liefel prepare the meal, just as was customary in Runental. When Merrow reached Whisper Brook, only the gentle splashing of water, the soft rustling of grass, and the quiet chirping of crickets could be heard. Sitting on a smooth stone at the bank was Liam. Barefoot, though the water was too cold to step into, his fishing rod held calmly in his hand, his gaze focused on the float. Merrow approached quietly and whispered, "Well, are they biting?" Liam looked up and smiled. "Hello, Merrow. So far, I haven't caught anything, but I have a good feeling about today." Liam was experienced. He lived right by the river and had earned himself a fishing rod from the dwarves a year ago, a masterpiece made for mountain trout fishing, light, precise, indestructible. "I need to catch as many fish as possible today," Merrow said as he sat down beside him. "Hyob promised to ask the dwarves if they would build one for me too." Liam nodded. "My rod cost me 40 mountain trout back then, a fair price for such a marvel." He held it up. It shimmered dully in the morning sun, a slender handle of dark wood with delicate engravings. "We'll manage it. You can count my fish today as well," he added generously. "Sit down. I've prepared a new bait, mashed marsh worms mixed with bread dough from the baker. If the fish don't bite on that, then we really have a problem." Merrow grinned, took the small wooden box with the bait, carefully threaded it onto the hook, and cast the line into the water with a practiced swing. Calm and patient, they sat side by side staring at their floats. On the backside of the farm, things were far less calm. John had built a new stable for the pigs the day before. In the old enclosure stood 6 powerful wild boars, true forest creatures that Hyob had captured deep in the woods a few days earlier. Now they were meant to serve as strong breeding animals on John's farm, to refresh the bloodline. But so far, things had gone anything but smoothly. The animals snorted with anger, especially the large, stocky boar with enormous tusks, standing at the front, tense and threatening, his eyes gleaming. The sow kept the piglets close to her, while 2 other females watched every movement of the 3 woodland elves with suspicion. Flo, John, and Hyob stood helplessly at the edge of the enclosure. "I've seen a lot of livestock," John muttered, pushing his hat back from his forehead. "But this is another league. I can't even see over the boar's back. He's massive." "He won't cooperate willingly," Flo said calmly. "We have to separate him from the rest of the herd somehow. Only then can we examine him." Hyob, who had captured the animals himself, frowned. "They're wild boars, true forest dwellers, no idea what they're used to." He thought for a moment, then reached into his pocket. "I'll try to separate them with food." He pulled out a handful of dried chestnuts, crushed bark pieces, and roasted grain kernels. Simple farm feed, not forest food, but strongly scented. "We sometimes use this to lure stray pigs back home. I don't know if it'll work, but maybe they'll get curious." Flo nodded. "It's worth a try. If we can lure the boar into the back section, we might have a chance." Hyob calmly tossed the mixture over the fence. They stood there, watching the animals, hoping that wild instincts might be influenced by a bit of farmer's cleverness. Meanwhile, the 2 women stepped out of the kitchen with a large jug of homemade lemonade and a few glasses. Liefel called out, "Come and have a drink first. Don't let it get you down." The 3 woodland elves were thirsty and, visibly grateful for the gesture, drank the lemonade with pleasure. Sweat glistened on their brows as the wild boars continued to grunt, unimpressed. John said to Hyob, "Your plan doesn't seem to be working either. The pigs are eating, but they're not separating." Hyob frowned, took a step back, and crossed his arms. "They're smarter than I thought," he murmured. Then his gaze drifted toward Thunder Mountain, becoming thoughtful. "If we can't convince the boars with food, then maybe someone else can." The other two looked at him questioningly. Hiob grinned. "Maybe Goron?" Flo raised an eyebrow. "You want to call Goron the giant?" Hiob nodded seriously. "You know how much he loves Liefel's apple pie. Every time I meet him, he asks if I have some, and then he raves about it being the best cake he's ever tasted." Liefel said, "The apple pie won't be the problem. It's quickly made. Send him an owl and ask if he can come." No sooner said than done. John added, "Hopefully the writing is big enough." Hiob took a deep breath and said calmly, "Now all we can do is wait." He looked up at the sky, where the owl had already become a small dot between the clouds. Dory smiled. "In the meantime, you can go down to the river and bring the boys home. Lunch will be ready soon." Liefel nodded in agreement. "Then we'll eat together at midday and see how things develop afterward." So it was done. John scattered some fresh hay into the stall for the wild boars, while Flo and Hiob walked down the narrow path toward Whisper Brook. There, Liam and Mero were still sitting, focused but visibly frustrated. The floats on the water barely moved, and the mood was subdued. "Well?" Hiob asked quietly. "Caught anything yet?" Mero shook his head, annoyed. "I don't know. Nothing is biting. Looks like I won't be getting my dwarf rod after all." Hiob grinned. "Maybe the fish just aren't early risers," he said. "Come on, let's head back for lunch. And who knows, maybe you'll have more luck this afternoon." Liam and Mero pulled their rods from the water, carefully laid them on a flat stone, and followed Flo and Hiob back to the farm. There, under the shade of old apple trees, a large wooden table was already set with steaming bowls, fresh bread, herb butter, and the scent of grilled vegetables drifting through the warm air. Lunch was simple home cooking, but that was exactly what the woodland elves loved. Fresh vegetables from the garden, homemade bread toasted in garlic butter, a stew of potatoes, mushrooms and leeks, hard-boiled eggs. Nothing special, and precisely for that reason so comforting. The other woodland elves liked it the same way, honest, nourishing, prepared with care. When everyone sat back, full and content, Flo leaned against his chair, wiped his hands on a cloth, and said to John, "I think in the meantime we should reinforce the stables. You underestimated the strength of these animals when you built them." John laughed roughly. "You're probably right. These aren't pigs, they're monsters." He glanced toward the stall. "But I'm glad. Now we have a proud bloodline and can build a strong herd." Hiob nodded. "So we wait for the giant's reply and use the time wisely." While the three men began inspecting the stall doors, Liam and Mero slipped quietly behind the house. Curious, they peered over the fence where the wild boars lay in the sun, huge muscular animals with bristly hides. "Come on, Mero, you have to see this," Liam whispered excitedly. "They're monsters. One of them would feed the whole village festival." The two stood in awe by the enclosure when suddenly an odd smell reached their noses. "What's that?" Mero murmured. "Something smells strange." Their eyes fell on the remains of the feed the men had used earlier to lure the animals. Mero crouched down, picked up a bit of it, smelled it, and frowned. Then his face lit up. "Oh my goodness! Liam! I think the fish would love this." He pulled a piece of bread from his pocket, spread some of the mixture onto it, and carefully tucked it away. "Let's try this later as bait. Maybe it'll work." Together, the two ran back toward Whisper Brook, carrying with them renewed hope for the longed-for dwarf rod. Meanwhile, Dory and Liefel cleared the dishes, washed the bowls, and wiped down the tables. Liefel, still wearing her apron, looked at Dory and said, "Just to be safe, I'll start baking an apple pie. If Goron really comes, he shouldn't leave empty-handed." Dory nodded. "Good idea. But one tray probably won't be enough for a giant." They laughed, and the scent of apples, cinnamon, and dough slowly filled the house. No sooner had the two boys returned to Whisperbrook than they wasted no time. With nimble fingers, they baited their hooks with the unusual, strongly scented mixture. The moment Mero's hook touched the water, his float jerked, a sharp tug, and with a small cry, he pulled the rod upward. A magnificent mountain trout thrashed on the line, shimmering in blue and silver. "I've got one," Mero shouted, and before Liam could finish congratulating him, his own float disappeared beneath the surface, and he too pulled a trout from the water. They laughed, understanding without words. Today was their day. Using the new bait, this unusual but effective recipe, they pulled one fish after another from the brook. They worked with focus, and in less than 2 hours their catch was complete. 40 strong mountain trout, exactly the number Mero needed. Liam looked over at him, saw the glow in Mero's face, the joy, the relief. "Mero," he said quietly, "you'll get your dwarf rod. Hyob keeps his word. But the dwarves will build it especially for you, just like they did mine. That takes about 2, maybe 3 weeks, so don't be disappointed if you have to wait." Mero nodded. He already knew. Hiob had explained it to him. Of course he would have loved to have the rod immediately, but patience was a virtue, and it was one the woodland elves of Runental learned almost from birth. To keep the fish fresh until transport to the dwarf settlement, Liam and Mero had fixed a large net in the water beforehand, securely anchored between 2 stones at a deep spot in the brook. There they gathered their catch, alive, cooled by the clear water flowing around them, a natural holding tank, and a sign to anyone passing by. Today had been a good day. Meanwhile, things were also progressing in the kitchen. The first tray of apple pie was finished, and the second tray was already in the oven, a safety pie, as Liefel jokingly called it. The 2 elven women sat at the table, talking quietly about herb recipes and a new tea blend made from cinnamon and hibiscus. Suddenly, a soft, dull knock sounded at the window, an owl. Quite exhausted, its feathers ruffled, and a far too large scroll tied to its leg. Liefel laughed. That scroll can only be from the giant. She opened the window, carefully loosened the ribbon from the owl's leg, and scattered a few corn kernels onto the windowsill. "Poor thing," she said gently. "The giant probably doesn't care much about your load." The owl snorted softly, fluttered its wings once, and began to eat. Liefel unrolled the message. Only a few words were scribbled across it. "Not today, too late, tomorrow 7 o'clock. Will come on time." That was all, and yet the giant handwriting filled nearly the entire page. With the scroll in hand, Liefel went outside across the yard to the stables, where Jan, Flo, and Hyob were reinforcing the fences. "News from the giant," she called out. Jan read the message, scratched his chin, and sighed theatrically. "So, tomorrow then." He turned to Flo. "Brother-in-law, is it a problem if you stay here tonight? You can sleep in Liam's room. Liam and Mero can make themselves comfortable in the hayloft. They both love that." Flo smiled. "No, that actually sounds like a lovely idea. A farm holiday. We haven't had one of those in a long time." He looked at Jan. "What do you think about going to the Forest Inn tonight? Macro is waiting there." He winked. "Then he can take a message to Hera so she doesn't worry, and we can have a mug or 2 of mead with my brother Figo." Jan laughed. "There's no better reason to go to the Forest Inn than visiting your brother and sending a message to your sister." He grinned. Dory and Leophil will understand and let us go." Hiob brushed the dust from his trousers, looked at the two men, and nodded decisively. "Very well, my friends. I'll be heading off now. I'll be here tomorrow morning at 7. You know how important that is." He looked seriously at Flo and John. "The giant doesn't trust easily, and if I'm not there, this could all go wrong. See you tomorrow." He slung his bow over his shoulder, glanced briefly at the sky, and added, "I still have a few things to take care of, but I think we'll see each other later at the Forest Inn." Then he set off down the path toward Whisper Brook, where the water lapped softly against the bank. When Hiob reached the small dock by Whisper Brook, he saw them immediately, Merrow and Liam overjoyed, their cheeks flushed and their eyes shining. Hiob stepped up to the net, cast a critical glance inside, and grinned. "Oh, that looks like a dwarf rod to me. You really put your backs into it." He bent down, pulled the net a little further into the shade, and secured it carefully to the dock. "Make sure the fish are well secured. We don't want them swimming away by tomorrow." Then he looked at the boys. "I'll bring them to the dwarves tomorrow after we're done with the boars. They'll be thrilled." Liam asked curiously, "Why not today? Haven't you examined the boars yet?" Hiob chuckled softly. "No, my boy, the boars, they're too clever for us." He smiled. "Tomorrow we'll have a visitor from Thunder Mountain. Goron will come, and with his help we can sort and examine the animals." He looked at Merrow. "And from what I've heard, you'll be spending the night here at the farm with your family." He stroked his beard. "Now I really must go. We'll see each other." Liam and Merrow were beside themselves with joy. So much luck in one single day, they could hardly believe it. The great catch in Whisper Brook, the shared night at the farm, and tomorrow, the visit of the giant. A being they had so far only known from stories. Full of excitement, they secured their catch. With practiced hands, they fastened a net over the holding basket, stretched it with small wooden stakes, weighted it with stones, just to be safe. Then they made a pact, the special bait, their shared secret. "No one must know," Liam whispered. "That way we'll be the only ones who can reliably catch mountain trout." Merrow nodded. Then they ran back to the farm and slipped through the back door straight into the kitchen, where the sweet scent of freshly baked apple pie greeted them. Outside by the well, John and Flo stood in their underclothes, laughing as they thoroughly washed the dirt of the wild boars from their skin and hair. When they entered the kitchen a little later, Leophil and Dory looked at them with amused smiles. "Two attractive elves in their underwear are a rare sight on our farm," Leophil joked, placing fresh clothes on the table. "Get changed and then try the apple pie. The third tray is still in the oven. I think we're allowed a piece today." The men dried off, changed, and sat down at the kitchen table. Liam and Merrow were already there, their faces flushed, their eyes sparkling, eagerly telling of their catch. Flo leaned back, looked around the room, and finally said, "You know, John and I still need to go to the Forest Inn. Macro is waiting there, and I want to give him a message for Hera, so she doesn't worry." Leophil and Dory exchanged a glance and began to laugh. "Of course," Dory said. "We already guessed as much. But don't worry, we're coming with you." "Exactly," Leophil added. "The boys are coming too. We'll all eat dinner together at the Forest Inn and end the day comfortably." Flo shot John a mischievous look, and John grinned back. "Not a bad idea," he said. "If our wives come along, at least someone can support us on the way home, if the mead is too strong." Everyone laughed, and the mood was full of anticipation. Merrow beamed. "This is one of the best days of my life. First the fish, then we sleep here at the farm. We go to the Forest Inn, and tomorrow we see the giant for the first time. It doesn't get any better than this." The sun was already low, casting a golden shimmer over the meadows of Runental. The small group, Flo, Dory, John, Liafil, Liam and Mero, set out on the path to the forest inn. It was a familiar trail, about 20 minutes on foot, leading past hazel bushes, moss-covered rocks, and narrow paths winding through low woodland. The way gently sloped downward, and with every step the air grew cooler, the ground softer, threaded with roots and fallen leaves. Mero walked ahead, a branch in his hand like a walking stick, while the adults chatted leisurely behind him. The apple pie still lay warm in their stomachs. No one was hungry, yet they all looked forward to seeing Figo and Macro again. Then, after a gentle bend in the path, the valley opened before them, and there lay Lake Mist, nestled between trees, quietly steaming in the last light of the day. There, where the glass stream had its source, stood the forest inn, the Chuckling Toad. Lanterns flickered at the corners of the thatched roof, warm light shone through the windows, and the first voices and laughter drifted across the water. It was a place that promised the evening would not simply end, but gently begin with stories, songs, and the warm glow of togetherness. The group settled outside at a large wooden table. The forest inn was well attended. Many elven families were enjoying the first mild September night. Children ran between the tables, and above it all lay the hum of cheerful voices. Just as they sat down, Rava stepped out of the common room. "What a lovely surprise," she called with her warm smile. "I'll let Figo know right away that you're here. What can I bring you?" The two men each ordered a mug of mead, while the others chose fresh grape juice. Rava, the innkeeper and Figo's wife, wrote down the order, winked at Mero, and disappeared back inside. Only a few minutes later, Figo himself came out, tall, broad-shouldered, with a slightly tousled beard. "Well, this is a wonderful sight. Hello, everyone. Macro already told me you'd be stopping by tonight. I'm really glad to see you." He wiped his forehead with a cloth. "But you'll have to be a bit patient. Inside it's chaos at the moment. The Elder Council is meeting in the side room, and otherwise we're busy everywhere. But as soon as things calm down, Rava and I will gladly join you." "No rush, dear brother," Flo said with a smile. "We're staying with John and Liafil tonight. Please tell Macro to come out to me for a moment. I need to give him a message for Hera." "Of course," Figo nodded. "Right away." And with that he disappeared back into the inn. John frowned slightly. The Elder Council is meeting? Now, right in the middle of the holidays? I wonder what there is to discuss. Liafil shrugged lightly. "We'll surely find out. Once they're finished, they might join us and tell us what it's about." Just then, Rava returned with the drinks, placed them on the table with a smile, and set down a basket of freshly baked bread before quietly withdrawing again. The group sat in silence for a moment, sipping their drinks, breathing in the mild evening air, and enjoying the comforting sense of community beneath the first stars of the night. The door of the forest inn opened again, and Macro stepped outside, followed by Errol and Nori Crontyler. Errol, the younger brother of Dory and Jan, slid up to the table with his usual mischievous grin. "Hello, my dears. What brings you to the forest inn? It's so good to see you. May we join you?" Nori, his wife, greeted Mero warmly. "Well, my nephew, I haven't seen you in a while. How are you? Still fishing diligently?" Mero nodded eagerly. "Yes, and today Liam and I had really good luck." As the two sat down and greetings continued with hugs and smiles, Flo gently drew Macro aside to speak with him privately. Just then, Rava came out again with a full tray, loaded with mugs of mead and several small, finely crafted schnapps glasses. She placed the tray on the table, rubbed her hands together, and said cheerfully, "Here you go, my dears. Help yourselves. This round is on Errol, and these little glasses here. Those are for the ladies. Nori made the schnapps herself, peppermint liqueur. You'll love it truly, a specialty. We've already tried a few today, so don't hold back. She took a small glass herself, raised it with a wink, and toasted the group. One by one they reached for the tray, thanked her, and returned the toast. Macro now rose slowly, smoothed his vest, and said calmly, I should be going. I still have a long raft journey ahead of me. But don't worry, tomorrow evening I'll be back here to pick you up, Flo. Dory gave him a teasing smile. Oh, you're in such a hurry. Why don't you stay and have another drink with us, Macro? She knew exactly that his thoughts were already with Hera, but she couldn't resist teasing him a little. Macro waved it off. Sorry, I've already had a bit of mead today, and for the raft trip I need a clear head. Flo grinned broadly. By the time you reach the edge of the forest and talk to Hera, the mead will surely have worn off. A faint blush rose in Macro's face again. Then Nori said with a smile, Here, Macro, I have a small bottle of peppermint liqueur. Please give it to Hera if you see her tonight. Macro accepted it, nodded his thanks, and said softly, Enjoy the celebration. We'll see each other tomorrow. He turned, descended the steps to the road, and disappeared into the dim evening. The door to the Forest Inn opened once more, and Figo stepped outside as well, carrying a full tray in his hands. Glasses clinked, mead shimmered in the lantern light, and a fragrant herbal schnapps announced itself in small bottles. Now, he said loudly, this is where the mood finally lifts. He set the tray down and grinned at his brother. Flo, you've done it again, gathered half the family. That practically demands music. And as if summoned, two familiar figures appeared. Balin Quelbach, the older brother of Macro, powerfully built, with a weathered face and an accordion under his arm. Beside him stood Sandro Setstein, the head cook of the wizarding school, a round, ever-cheerful woodland elf with fine hair and a guitar case slung over his back. Well, if this isn't a coincidence, Figo called. Come on over, you two. Have a seat. There's still room, and those strings are already thirsting for you. The two musicians didn't hesitate. They squeezed between benches and chairs, nodded friendly greetings to the group, and unpacked their instruments. The first chords rang out, soft, playful, then stronger, rhythmic. Balin began an old elven song that told of the glow of the flame gorge and the mists of the enchanted forest. Sandro accompanied him on the guitar, warm and smooth like honeyed wine. The mood at the table lifted, faces began to glow, shoulders relaxed, laughter grew louder. It was as if the evening had only been waiting for this moment to truly awaken. Figo leaned toward Flo and said with a wink, Do you remember how we used to sit at this very table? With Father and Uncle Merk, back then, before we knew how quickly time passes. Flo nodded, his gaze briefly softening. Yes, he said quietly. And now we're sitting here, with our children, our wives, and the music still sounds just as beautiful as it did back then. Just as another song was being struck up, a soft crunching sounded on the gravel path in front of the Forest Inn. Hyob emerged from the twilight, raised his hand in greeting, and quietly joined the group. Hardly had he sat down when the door of the common room opened again. The Elder Council had finished its meeting. The elders stepped outside, dignified, calm, with quiet authority in their movements. They nodded to the gathering and took their places. No official speeches, no announcements, just the silent signal. Tonight was an evening of community. Joha Setzholz, chairman of the Elder Council, sat down beside Flo and leaned toward Miro, his grandson. In a calm voice he asked, So, how many fish was it this time? Miro beamed, his eyes shining in the lantern light. 40, and the best part, I'm getting my own fishing rod. Joha laughed warmly. Then you're truly on your way to becoming a real fisherman. The mead flowed, the music grew livelier. The voices of the elves sang old songs, some softly, others full of strength. The melodies drifted across the tables, over the meadow in front of the inn, and carried up into the mountains. There, high above on Thunder Mountain, Goron sat on a rocky ledge. He gazed into the distance, down into the valley. And though his ears seemed large and heavy, it was as if they caught every note. He closed his eyes and hummed along softly, a deep tone that blended with the wind. Down in the valley, time passed as if in a dream. But eventually, as the mugs grew emptier, the music gentler, and the conversations quieter, John rose and placed a hand on his brother-in-law's shoulder. "Come, Flo, let's head home. Tomorrow will be a big day." Dory and Leafield nodded, and Liam and Mero were already yawning. And so the small group said their goodbyes, waved once more to the others, and set off on the path back to the farm. The trail lay soft in the moonlight, and above Lake Mist, the starlight shimmered and danced. Behind them, the forest inn remained, a place full of laughter, music, and memories that would stay with them for a long time. John and Flo struck up an old song, their voices warm and slightly off-key, clearly affected by the mead and liqueur. Laughing, supported by their wives, they finally reached the farm as the moon stood silver above the meadows. Liam and Mero quietly climbed the wooden stairs up to the hayloft. The freshly scented hay rustled beneath their hands as they settled down. They whispered for a while about the wonderful day, about the fish, the giant, the adventure to come. But tiredness soon laid a gentle spell over their words. The voices grew softer, thoughts blurred, and before long they fell asleep. Gradually, silence returned to the farm. The animals rested peacefully, the wind whispered through the trees, and even Whisperbrook seemed to breathe more slowly. Runental slept, in deep, well-earned rest, while above it all, the promise of a new morning kept watch. Even before the scent of toasted bread and herbal tea filled the kitchen, a door creaked softly open in the barn above. Mero peeked out sleepily, his hair tousled, his eyes still half closed. Leafield, who was just placing a bowl on the table, looked up at him. "Breakfast will be ready soon, my dear," she called gently. "I'm coming right away," Mero replied. But instead of coming down, he ran barefoot down the wooden stairs, across the yard, through the damp grass, and straight to the bank of Whisperbrook. When he reached the spot where the net had been fastened the day before, he knelt down immediately. His heart beat faster. But when he looked into the water, he let out a breath of relief. All the mountain trout were still there. The net had held. "Thank you," he whispered, to no one in particular, perhaps to the brook itself. Then he jumped up, ran back to the house, and slipped into the warm kitchen where Liam had already arrived. While breakfast was being eaten inside and outside, Hiob sat with Flo and John by the well. A distant sound reached them, a low rumble, a deep, slow vibration that travelled through the ground and made the cups on the table tremble. Hiob smiled calmly. "That is him." Everyone fell silent. Out of the morning mist drifting down from Thunder Mountain, a silhouette emerged, slowly, heavily, yet not threatening. Then he stepped out of the haze, Goron, the giant. About 3.5 meters tall, powerfully built, with a broad back and large, steady hands. His face was round and kind, his eyes gentle, his nose wide, his lips shaped into the faintest hint of a smile. A long, unkempt full beard framed his face, and his hair, slightly damp with dew, fell in thick, natural-coloured strands over his shoulders. He wore a coarse, earth-toned garment of felted wool, embroidered with moss along the edges, and over his shoulder hung a large linen sack. Every movement he made was slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. No word left his lips, yet his mere presence changed the atmosphere. And so Goron stepped to the edge of the yard, stopped, looked toward Hiob, and waited. Hiob stepped closer to Goron and explained the situation to him. Goron gave a brief nod and moved toward the enclosure, carefully opened the wooden gate, and stepped inside. The wild boars had already pressed themselves into a corner, the sow with the piglets farthest back, two strong sows in front of her, and at the very front, defiant yet clearly unsettled, the boar. One could sense that even his courage was fading. He still stood in front like a leader, but his posture betrayed the truth. Against this primal force, no resistance would help. Goron walked toward him without haste. With a calm, almost fatherly gesture, he placed his hand on the boar's neck, stroked the massive head, then slipped his hands beneath the front legs, and lifted the animal slightly off the ground. He held it effortlessly, yet gently, like a heavy basket full of apples. Then he turned, carried the boar slowly over to Flo, and set him down. Flo hesitated for a moment. He was prepared, and yet not for this kind of help. Then he nodded gratefully to Goron and began the examination. Ears, teeth, legs, skin. Everything seemed in order. A strong, healthy boar. When Flo was finished, Goron carried the animal into the designated stall, returned, and continued wordlessly and steadily with the next one, then the next, until all had been examined and safely housed. Throughout the entire time, the giant did not speak a single word. He worked like a silent helper, with great strength and the same calm with which trees grow. When the last wild boar had found its place, Goron turned and left the enclosure. He walked slowly across the yard, past the astonished men, and took the path down toward Whisper Brook. Mero and Liam, who had watched the scene from the barn, were electrified. The moment Goron moved, they jumped up, slipped out the back door, and took a small shortcut through the undergrowth to reach the brook ahead of him. Hiob also set off and accompanied the giant. Down at Whisper Brook, Goron bent over the water, dipped both hands in, and washed his face. The drops beaded on his skin like dew on oak leaves. He scooped water again and let it run over his powerful arms. His breathing was calm, his gaze still, and the two boys watching him from a distance stood utterly silent, holding their breath. Suddenly, the giant turned his head toward the two boys. His eyes, large, grey, and deep-set, fixed on Mero and Liam, who were standing at the bank of Whisper Brook, still but alert. Their posture made it clear. They were guarding something, their catch, their pride, their moment. Goron watched them for a long moment, then turned to Hiob and spoke softly to him, a deep, guttural murmur. Hiob listened, nodded, and called out to the boys, "Come a little closer. Goron would like to see your catch." The two hesitated briefly, then Mero stepped forward and pulled aside the protective net. In the clear water, the mountain trout shimmered, packed closely together, lively and strong. The giant looked at them, long and silently, then reached into his coat pocket and took out a glowing crystal, light blue, faceted, powerful, not a piece of jewelry, but a fragment of mountain soul. He handed it to Hiob, who turned and walked to the boys. "Goron gives you this crystal as recognition for your patience while fishing." The two boys gazed reverently at the glowing stone. Hiob smiled faintly. "I will take it to the dwarves. Liam, I will take your rod with me. They will refine it with this crystal. And Mero, for you, they will craft a new rod, using a piece of the same stone." There was a moment of silence. Then both boys nodded, a nod that said more than words. Hiob turned back to Goron. "We'll go back to the farm briefly," he said, "say our goodbyes, and get your apple pie." The giant only nodded, and together they set off. At the farm, Liefil was already waiting with a bundle wrapped in cloth, still slightly warm, the apple pie. She smiled when she saw the giant, an honest, respectful smile. "For you, Goron," she said softly. "As promised." Goron bowed slightly, and in his size, even that was an impressive gesture. Then everyone said their farewells. Jan, Flo, and Dory stood in the yard, thanked Goron for his help, and wished him a safe journey back to the mountains. The giant said nothing. He only nodded, thoughtful and steady, like an old tree agreeing with the wind. Then Goron and Hiob slowly made their way back toward Whisper Brook. At the brook, Mero and Liam had already prepared everything. The net with the fish was secured, and Liam handed Hiob his dwarf-crafted rod with a proud yet calm expression. "Take good care of it," he said. Hiob nodded, shouldered his pack, and began carefully stowing everything away. The 40 mountain trout had already been cleaned, fastened to a pole, and wrapped in sturdy linen, ready for transport. Part of the load disappeared into Hiob's pack. Then he took the bundle of trout and handed it to Goron, who tucked it into one of his coat pockets as if it were nothing more than a bundle of herbs. Finally, only Hiob himself remained. The giant bent slightly forward, gently grasped the small woodland elf under the arms, and with a smooth motion placed him onto his right shoulder. Hiob chuckled and instinctively grabbed the giant's thick sleeve with one hand and his ear with the other, as if he had sat there many times before. Everyone watching had to smile. Mero nudged Liam with his elbow and whispered, "He looks like a squirrel on an old tree." Hiob grinned broadly and called down, "Don't laugh. How else am I supposed to keep up with Goron? Besides, sitting badly is still better than walking well." The giant let out a low rumble, his way of laughing, and began to walk toward the mountains with steady steps. And so they departed, the great Goron, slow and silent, and the small Hiob perched on his shoulder like a travelling king in simple clothes. Whisper Brook murmured softly behind them, and over Runental spread the warm glow of a peaceful autumn day. On the southern bank of the glass stream, not far from the small forest clinic, 4 figures were sitting on a soft, moss-covered clearing. Hera, the young healer with shimmering hair, had invited them to a small picnic, and Macro, her quiet admirer and the ferryman of Runental, had gladly accepted. Jasmine and Tisoi Setzholz were there as well, Macro's sister Jasmine and Tisoi, the brewmaster of Runental, whose mead was famous far and wide. The air was warm and scented with lemongrass and tropical blossoms. Between the roots of an old fig tree stood a woven basket filled with all kinds of delicacies: ripe mangosteens, bananas, grilled yam roots, small coconut rolls, and 2 bottles of Tisoi's homemade coconut wine, called tuba in his homeland. Hera and Jasmine chatted animatedly about a new tea blend made from cinnamon, moringa leaves, and hibiscus, a mixture that was both calming and strengthening. "Moringa helps especially well against fatigue," Jasmine explained as she rubbed a few of the delicate leaves between her fingers. "And combined with ginger, it can even speed up the healing of wounds." Macro watched quietly as he peeled a mango with his knife. His gaze kept drifting back to Hera as she spoke softly with Jasmine. Moments like these were rare for him. Time passed quickly, and yet it was precious. Eventually, Macro glanced at his sundial, a simple piece of wood set with a crystal, and stood up. "I have to go," he said quietly. Hera took Macro's hand and whispered, "I have a surprise for you. There was a small note attached to my brother's message. I'm supposed to close the clinic and accompany you to visit my relatives as well." Macro's eyes lit up. He turned to Tisoi and said, "Please help Hera tidy up. I need to get to the ferry and prepare everything. We'll meet there." Clearly excited, he ran off toward the river. All 3 laughed and began gathering the picnic things. Hera packed everything away, closed the clinic, checked once more that everything was in order, and then headed for the ferry. From far away, she saw a small cloud of dust, and Macro, broom in hand. She smiled, but said nothing. "Where are the others?" Macro asked. "They decided to walk back and collect herbs and mushrooms," Hera replied. Macro could hardly believe his luck, just him and Hera alone on the ferry. "Unfortunately, we still have to stop at the mill," Macro said. "I need to deliver 5 sacks of flour to the baker before we head to the Forest Inn." Hera simply answered, "That's fine," and sat down at the edge of the ferry. Macro cast off, and the boat glided slowly upstream. The soft hum of the dwarven mechanism accompanied the journey as the water slipped calmly beneath them. After a while, Hera stood and stepped beside Macro, watching attentively as he confidently and carefully operated the complex steering system, levers, gears, and cables moving smoothly beneath his hands. It was clear that he knew every motion, felt every current. Hesitant at first, then determined, Macro put his arm around Hera. She allowed it and leaned slightly against him. His heart beat faster, and Hera too felt the quiet happiness of this first step from the usually so shy ferryman. Neither of them said a word, yet this moment said everything. After about half an hour, the ferry glided up to a magnificent watermill on the eastern side of the river. Macro moved a few levers, the ferry gently turned left, and docked cleanly at the wooden pier. Together, they left the boat and walked toward the mill. "Will, are you here?" Macro called out. The side door near the water wheel opened, and a strong woodland elf with a white, full beard, long hair, and pale green skin stepped outside. Will Krontyler, the master baker of Runental and Dory's brother. A moment later, the main door opened as well, and Mona came out, greeting them with an open smile. Mona was the miller. She had inherited the mill from her father. Will had learned the trade from his father-in-law. He had originally been a grain farmer, but through Mona had entered the milling business. "Come in, have a drink with us, or are you hungry?" she asked kindly. But Macro waved it off. "Sorry, Mona. We're in a hurry. I'm just picking up the 5 sacks of flour for Balin. Will already knows." Mona nodded, slightly disappointed. "All right, maybe next time. Have a good journey." And she disappeared back into the house. Will had already brought the 5 sacks of flour down to the dock. Macro and Hera loaded them onto the ferry, said their goodbyes, and continued their journey. Macro looked content. One could see how comfortable he felt now that Hera was with him. After another half-hour of travel, they reached the bakery. It lay on the west side of the glass stream, just before the Forest Inn. This time, Macro steered to the right and docked again. Balin Quelbach, Macro's brother, was already waiting at the pier. "Hello, you two. Thank you for bringing the flour. It's really tight, and I still have a lot of bread to prepare for tomorrow," he said. Macro grinned. "So? Were you still at the Forest Inn for long last night?" Balin laughed. "Yes, a few more mugs than planned before I finally made it home." At that moment, Loro stepped out of the bakery, Balin's wife and the older sister of Rava, the innkeeper of the Forest Inn. "Hello there. Our master baker was out a bit longer than intended last night. That's why he looks the way he does today," she joked. In her hands, she held 2 large loaves of bread. "One is for you. Send Dory my warm regards, and please bring the second one to my sister." Hera thanked her warmly. Meanwhile, Macro and Balin unloaded the flour. The ferry set off again, this time heading for the Forest Inn. When they arrived at the Forest Inn, the ferry lay quietly at the dock. The sun stood high over Runental, bathing the meadows in warm light and making the waters of the glass stream shimmer softly. Hera looked around for a moment, took a deep breath, and felt the pleasant calm of the early afternoon. Then she turned to Macro. Her voice was calm, but there was gentle hope in her eyes. "Will you come with me to visit my relatives? I'm sure they'll be happy, and I would be very happy too." Macro didn't hesitate. A quiet smile crossed his face. "Gladly," he said simply. He took her hand, carefully at first, then more firmly. Hera let it happen and returned the pressure. Together they set off toward John and Liefil's farm. Their steps were slow, almost deliberate, as if they wanted to hold on to the moment. Above them, insects hummed in the sunlight, and the path ahead suddenly felt like more than just a trail through Runental. It felt like a small beginning, quiet, warm, and full of promise. On the way to the farm, they met Mero and Liam at Whisperbrook, and Mero proudly told Macro about his great catch. After a short while, they reached the farm. Dory and Liefil were in the kitchen, processing the fruits Dory had brought with her. They were experimenting with a new recipe, a banana cake with chocolate glaze and fine coconut shavings sprinkled on top. Hera immediately joined them and helped out. John was outside, cracking open fresh coconuts and letting the clear water flow into a clay jug. When he saw Macro, he said, "Oh, good. You can take over right away." "We'll chill this," he added, "and drink it later. It's healthy, and just the right thing after last night." Flo stood beside him, scraping the coconut flesh from the shells and spreading it out on a linen cloth. "It dries quickly. The wind is good, and it's warm enough too." In the kitchen, Liefil stirred the batter while Dory worked on the cocoa beans. "We'll make the glaze from these. Agreed?" "Absolutely," John called. "But Flo and I are going over to Bug for a moment. I'll get us some fresh honey for the cake." "Good idea," Liefil said. Dory called after them. "Send our love." "Will do," Flo replied briefly, and the two men set off. Bug's farm lay about 10 minutes east of John's. He was the older brother of John and Dory, along with Will the miller and Errol the youngest. Bug was married to Lisa of House Quelstein. On the way, John and Flo talked about honey. John spoke of his own beehives and how much work and patience it took for a good year. Unfortunately, he had already given all his honey to Tesoi as a contribution to the upcoming rice harvest festival. "But it was worth it," John said with a grin. "A festival lives on good ingredients." Flo nodded in agreement. "And good honey brings people together," he said quietly. When they arrived at Bug's farm, Bug was just in the middle of preparing honey liqueur. His farm focused on grain and vegetable cultivation. A few chickens, goats, and sheep also lived there. But his true passion was beekeeping. His wife Lisa was a hard-working farmer and, beyond that, a passionate dancer. Once a week, she led Runental's Zumba Club, a growing community of dance-loving elves who regularly met on meadows, farms, or at the village inn to dance together, laugh, and sometimes even sing. Often they were accompanied by Balin and Sandro with accordion and guitar. Lisa was athletic, fit, and full of energy. You would hardly guess her 40 years. She practiced yoga, taught physical education at the forest school, and organized the annual valley run of 25 kilometers, a true highlight of Runental's calendar. And she was the only teacher at the forest school who was not a member of the Elder Council. After a while, John and Flo said goodbye to Bug and Lisa. There were warm hugs, laughter, and more talk of honey, harvests, and the upcoming festival. Bug wiped his hands on his apron and said, "Then we'll see each other tonight at the Forest Inn. A shared dinner, we won't miss that." Lisa nodded with a smile. "Exactly. We'll definitely come. And maybe I'll bring a little dance if the music is good." John laughed. "Deal. Then we'll meet there later." Flo raised his hand in farewell. "See you tonight." he said quietly. And so they set off back toward the farm, while Bug and Lisa waved after them, carrying the firm promise of an evening together, good food, and cheerful company at the Forest Inn. Just as John and Flo were about to turn away, John stopped once more and scratched his beard thoughtfully. Then he turned back to Bug with a crooked grin. One more thing. I could still use a jar of honey, just a small one, for the cake. Bug raised an eyebrow. You know very well that I barely have any left, he said, crossing his arms, though he couldn't suppress a smile. If this were anyone else, I'd say no. John chuckled softly. I know, but I'm your brother. Bug sighed theatrically, shook his head, and went into the shed. Shortly after, he returned with a well-sealed jar of honey. Only because it's you, he said, pressing it into John's hand. And heaven help you if the cake turns out bad. John accepted the jar with mock reverence. The best cake in Runental, I promise. Flo smiled quietly, and together they finally said their goodbyes. As they left the farm, they heard Bug call after them, and tonight at the Forest Inn, I'm tasting it. The two men made their way back toward the farm, the jar of honey safely stowed. Even before they reached the yard, the sweet scent of baked fruit and warm chocolate hung in the air. In the kitchen, there was busy but cheerful activity. Liefel slowly poured the golden honey into the bowl. Dory stirred the batter with calm, practiced movements, and Hera handed over coconut flakes and chocolate pieces. Again and again they tasted, nodded, smiled. The cake grew layer by layer into something special. When it was finally finished, it was carefully taken from the oven and set aside to cool. The warmth lingered in the room long after. Then everything was tidied up, bowls washed, hands cleaned, aprons set aside. Outside in the yard, everyone changed into fresh clothes, tied back their hair, put on clean shirts and light garments. The chatter grew livelier, laughter mixed in, and anticipation for the evening was everywhere. Slowly the sun sank lower, bathing the meadows in golden light and casting long shadows across the farm. When everything was ready, they set off together toward the Forest Inn. The path was familiar, yet that evening it felt special. Conversations flowed gently, steps matched one another, and above it all lay a feeling of togetherness. Behind them, the farm fell silent, filled with the scent of cake. Ahead of them lay the Forest Inn, with warm light, set tables, and an evening that promised laughter, stories, and companionship. When they reached the Forest Inn, it was immediately clear that Figo and Rava had put in special effort. The tables had been arranged into long rows, creating one large communal space. Lanterns hung between the beams, candles flickered in the warm evening light, and everywhere there was that familiar feeling that something special was about to begin, just the way Runental loved it. On the small wooden platform at the edge of the square stood Balin and Sandro with their wives. The two men tuned their instruments while their wives sang softly, voices tentatively finding each other, then growing more confident. Chords rang out, faded, began again. Here a laugh, there an approving nod. It was only a rehearsal, and yet even now the music carried the promise of a long, lively evening. Throughout the late afternoon, siblings, relatives, and close friends arrived, everyone who could find the time. Gradually the gathering grew until finally around 50, perhaps 60 people were seated around the joined tables. Joha and Alea Setzholz from the Elder Council greeted many with calm warmth, as did Igor and Sabi Quellstein, Tom and Veri Holzapfel, and Rex and Irma Kronteiler. Greetings were exchanged, hands shaken, embraces shared. Bug received his promised piece of cake, but there was far from enough for everyone. That didn't dampen the mood at all. On the contrary, laughter and jokes followed, and someone remarked that a truly good cake had to be scarce. Others provided more food. Captain Jack, the ferryman of Lake Mist, arrived together with Tissoy and Jasmine, bringing a whole barrel of mead that was rolled into place with combined effort. Shortly afterward, fresh bread arrived from Baker Will Crontyler, still warm and fragrant, disappearing into baskets faster than one could watch. Not everyone could attend. Tissoy sent greetings from the far side of the lake. Chofiel and Babette, Saira and Loloy, and a few others had sent their apologies. They were deeply involved in preparations for the rice harvest festival, which would take place in 2 weeks. While conversations outside grew livelier, Rava and Figo had been hard at work in the kitchen of the Forest Inn. Large roasts lay sizzling in their pans, slowly cooked until the meat nearly fell apart on its own. Beside them bubbled heavy pots filled with hearty stews of root vegetables, beans and herbs, constantly tasted and refined. The aroma drifted out through the open door onto the square, mingling with the scent of fresh bread and mead and making more than one mouth water. When the dishes were finally carried out, bowls and platters passed from hand to hand. Everyone helped themselves, no one went hungry, and soon a satisfied murmur spread across the tables. And so the Forest Inn filled with voices, music, and movement. Mugs were raised, bread was broken, old stories were told, and new ones begun. It was one of those evenings when no one paid attention to time because everything that mattered was already there. High above, far from the warm light of the Forest Inn, the giant Goron sat on a rocky ledge on Thunder Mountain. As he so often did, he had taken his place there, his gaze directed down into the valley. The wind carried the sounds of music up to him, at first faint, then clearer, mixed with singing and laughter. Goron closed his eyes and listened. He loved these moments, loved the songs of the woodland elves that reached him like a greeting. Silent, almost reverent, he sat there and let the music flow through him, as if it were part of the mountain itself. Figo and Flo stood a little apart, each holding a mug of mead, letting their gaze wander across the square. Finally, Flo's eyes settled on Hera, his youngest sister. She stood beside Macro, closer than usual, their shoulders nearly touching, voices low, glances open and honest. Figo noticed it at once and grinned. "Finally," he said softly. "I was starting to think those two would never get anywhere." Flo snorted quietly, but warmth lay in his eyes. "Hera has always been cautious," he said calmly, "and Macro even more so. 2 quiet hearts simply need more time." He took a sip of mead, then added, "But now they both seem to know what they want." At that moment, Hera laughed softly, and Macro leaned a little closer to her. Flo watched the scene for another moment, then nodded with satisfaction, not protective, not skeptical, but relieved. Figo raised his mug. "To your little sister," he said with a wink, "and to the fact that she's found someone who suits her." Flo lifted his mug as well. "To Hera," he said quietly, "and to the truth that some paths must be walked slowly, but for that very reason, they are the right ones." Soon after, the mood shifted noticeably. The music grew livelier, the rhythm quicker, and Balin let his accordion ring out with strong tones. Sandro picked up the melody, and their wives joined in laughing. Liafil didn't hesitate for a second. With sparkling eyes, she grabbed Jan by the arm. "Come on," she said firmly. "Now we dance." Jan tried to protest, but was already being pulled along, laughing. Dory followed, immediately drawing Figo with her and turning in time with the music as if she had never done anything else. Before long, the space in front of the small stage filled with movement, steps finding one another, skirts swirling, laughter mixing with the music. Macro lingered at the edge for a moment, mug in hand, his expression uncertain. Dancing was not his strength, and certainly not in front of so many eyes. Hera looked at him, smiled, and held out her hand. It was a small gesture, but it was enough. Macro took a deep breath, set his mug aside, and let himself be drawn onto the dance floor. At first his steps were cautious, almost hesitant, but with every beat he grew more confident. Hera laughed softly, he laughed with her, and soon they moved together quite naturally to the rhythm of the music. Around them danced Jan and Leafil, Dory and Figo, friends and family. The woodland elves knew that such celebrations only come alive when one lets go of everyday life and simply lives. Dory danced with her brother-in-law Figo, their steps light and familiar as the music carried them along. Between two turns, she leaned closer so her voice wouldn't be lost in the sound of the instruments. "Well, Figo," she said with a smile, "have you seen your little sister? Hera seems completely changed today." Figo answered first with an easy dance step, deliberately sinking a little deeper into the rhythm, then looked at Dory openly and honestly. "I like Macro," he said calmly. "He's honest, a good man for Hera." He spun Dory once more, caught her again, and added, "And you know what? I'm glad it's him." Macro slowly approached Flo, who was standing at the edge of the square, taking in the evening one last time. He spoke softly, almost apologetically. "I think we should start heading off. We still have nearly 2 hours of travel ahead of us, and I have deliveries to make early tomorrow." Flo looked at him for a moment, then nodded in agreement. "You're right," he said calmly. "It's been a long day. A good one." Once more, he let his gaze wander over the square, to Dory and Leafil, to Figo, to Hera, who looked at Macro and offered him a quiet smile. Then Flo placed a hand on his shoulder. "Time to go home." Step by step, they said their farewells. Hugs, quiet words, promises to meet again soon. The ferry lay calmly at the dock, the water dark and smooth as glass. Macro worked the levers, and slowly the boat pulled away from the shore. Behind them, the forest inn vanished into the shadows of the trees, only its warm light lingering for a moment longer. Hera stood at Macro's side, embraced him, and a fine, quiet kiss was shared. The river carried them gently onward. Above them stretched a clear, star-filled sky, and the soft hum of dwarven machinery mingled with the quiet splashing of the water. Runental slept, full from music, community, and a day rich with stories. And as the ferry glided through the night, everyone on board knew this evening was a gift. So my dears, that was chapter 3. Next week, my dear husband will once again tell you a story from the Wizarding School, and I promise you, new secrets and exciting paths await there as well. If you enjoyed the journey, please subscribe to our channel, give us a like, and feel free to leave a comment. Your words mean a great deal to us and help Runental continue to grow. Until soon, my dears, and thank you for walking this path with us.